So in this video I want to cover a few different mistakes you want to avoid and how to solve them if you want to have technically strong landscape photos. One of the first things you learn when you're shooting with a long lens is how depth of field works, because it's so easy to miss focus. Obviously, when we are shooting in a landscape scene, for the most part, this is just a rule of thumb, you want to have your photos in focus, or at least your focal point is what you want to have in focus. When you're photographing in a relatively deep depth of field, that being in a forest with a lot of foreground, midground and background, then for the most part you want to shoot with a fairly close down aperture as to get everything in focus. However, when you're shooting in a big vista scene like I am, that is far away, then you can open up the aperture a little bit more and still have everything you want to have in focus in focus. So in the scene here in front of me, I want to have both the cows down in the field and the tree and the background fjord in focus. And in a scene like this, I can easily get away with an aperture of f5.6, f8, f11, a fairly open aperture. I'm shooting at f11 simply just to have everything pin sharp, or at least as sharp as I can have on a hot day like this with so many hot air pockets. So make sure to have everything that you want to have in focus. So the next mistake to avoid is to not spend enough time on your composition, and this is especially relevant on a telephoto lens. But I just want to go into the studio and show you this because there's simply too many cars driving here. So what I mean when I say spend a lot of time on your composition, it's not just about being patient and waiting for the foreground cows to actually be in the right position. It's just to get all those small details right that is very, very hard to see from a great distance. So in this example here, you can see I've actually cut a cow in half right here. And I also have this little spot of wood up here that is kind of also cut off. So if I just change the composition a little bit, the cow is now in the photo. However, I still have this little one up here that can be distracting. So by changing to this composition here, again some cows moved in, and then I've now cut those off, even though I've fixed the part up here. And in this example here, more cows came into the scene. I had to zoom a little bit out again, then I've included this again, and yeah, the cows here is a little bit too close to the edge of the frame here, so it didn't really work for me. So just making the decision to go to a horizontal instead. I'm still cutting off a cow here, and this little space here might also be a little bit too much. So of course I can always just crop it out and then I basically fixed it. But if you so desire to change it in the field, it just takes a little bit of zooming in and maybe move a little bit to the right, and then you should be good. So in this example here, the cows made this nice little curve here that could like lead you from down here in the corner and up into the frame here. The problem was just, again, I had this little bush here to battle with. So just changing my perspective a little bit, moving like 10 meters to the right, it simply just fixes that so easily. I can also zoom a little bit out, but then again, I'm including too much of this mess around here. Zooming even further out, I think that you can see here the wheat has started to change color. It might be a little bit too distracting. And again, I also have this space down here. However, I have included more of the background so you can actually see it's a fjord. And of course, a little boat came sailing in, which was what I hoped for, because I really wanted like a representation of Denmark here. So we have the wheat fields, we have the cattle, we have some different bushes and trees and a fjord and a little boat. So I really like this version here. I'm not too satisfied with how the wheat has started to change color here, but I think this is one of the more optimal. I also got a couple of horizontals where most of the cows had moved out, but I actually think I came away with a pretty good one right here. And here's another version with a few more cows. and another boat here in the background. I of course also wanted another horizontal. Only problem is, again, I'm including all this stuff over here, and maybe this little space down here can be distracting. I'm not totally sure about that. So I zoomed a little bit in, but whoopsie, now I cut off another cow. So I just waited for it to enter the scene, and here I have a pretty good, a pretty decent horizontal version of the scene, which includes everything worth looking at. So this is what I mean by spending time on your composition and taking a lot of different examples, so you make sure that you don't make all these small mistakes. Of course, this is also something I talk about in my ebooks on composition, so be sure to check those out down in the description. There's a link. I even have 2 free light versions that you can check out first if you are unsure what it is you're getting. So link in the description. So I've come back out into the field, literally. So you may recognize this from some of my earlier videos. It's actually quite funny. I have no clue about farming. I don't know anything about it, but you can see here, my lone tree is up here. Not mine, but someone else's. But the field here is actually full of weed this year. So last year it was canola, the yellow flower thing there. And 2 years ago it was barley. Like, there's barley in some of the other fields here in the background, but not this one. So apparently they change every year. Interesting. And I'm photographing the lone tree. And as you can see here, I am making a massive mistake. So as you can see, I have attached my camera, the hot shoe here, shooting vertical, and then I have put it down in this position here. Now the reason why this is problematic is if you're not really tightening this one a whole lot, even if you tighten it a whole lot, you will actually see, due to the weight of the lens, you will see it slide a little bit. You can take a photo here. If you take it with a fast shutter speed, you probably won't see it, but if you have just a little bit of a longer shutter speed, chances are that you will get blur. So make sure to absolutely don't do this, especially not with a telephoto lens. The best way to get around it is to get yourself an L bracket. Make sure to find one that works for your camera. Alternatively, you can use the lens collar with hopefully a shoe if your lens comes with one. This is my Sony 100-400 and I'm using the shoe from Kirk because the one that Sony provided simply just wasn't good enough. It didn't have the Arca Swish thingy here. So L bracket or lens collar. The reason why I'm saying this is that not all telephoto lenses actually comes with a lens collar, so you might have to go to eBay and find one. So yeah, that's also an option. Using a lens collar is by far the best way to stabilize your camera setup when you're using a telephoto lens. And that is because you have an equal amount of weight on either side of the center of gravity. So in that way, the camera won't fall to one side or the other. Even if I untied this one here, the camera is supposed to just stay here. And that is basically the best way to stabilize your lens. Alternatively, use an L bracket. The next mistake to avoid using a long lens is slightly shaken pictures due to wind. So there's a few different ways that you can stabilize your lens besides, of course, using the lens collar, as I just talked about. And if it's very windy, it's not very windy today, so it's not too bad. But if it's a little bit more windy, you almost cannot avoid micro shakes, even though you're shooting on a big tripod. So what I've done earlier today while I was shooting was simply to use a 5-second shutter delay, especially with as long as lens as this one. 2 seconds are not always enough, so 5 seconds. Another thing you can do is to actually activate image stabilization. The rule of thumb is not to use image stabilization when you're on a tripod, but sometimes when it's very windy, it can actually be beneficial. It depends a little bit on the image stabilization system and how it's designed in your camera and in your lens, but try it out and see what happens for your camera system. Another thing you can do, which is also a little bit controversial because usually we teach the opposite, is when it's very windy, you can actually just stabilize your camera by touching the lens or the camera, as long as you have a fast enough shutter speed. If it's very windy, for the most part, just forget about making long exposures anyway. But if you have still a pretty decent shutter speed, then you can actually stabilize it by just holding down on your lens. The last thing you can do to get sharp photos in windy conditions is simply just to pump up the shutter speed. Obviously, you will either have to open up the aperture, which reduces your depth of field, or you will have to push up the ISO, which reduces the image quality due to noise. So a fast shutter speed. The old rule of thumb is that you want to have a double shutter speed of your focal length. So if your focal length is 200 millimeter, you want to shoot at 1/400th of a millimeter. If you're shooting at 70 millimeter, you want to have as minimum a shutter speed of 1/140th of a second. So a great way to ensure success in landscape photography is to return to your favorite locations again and again and again. So that's what I've done right now. Shooting these two twin trees up here with the long lens. But back to the last mistake that you would want to avoid, for this video at least, and that is to not bring your telephoto lens. I hear it from time to time when I'm doing workshops. We are going to a location and people are like, "Mads, do I really have to bring the long lens going on this hike?" No, you don't have to bring it, but you may lose out on some really great shots if you don't bring it. If you think that your long lens, your telephoto lens, is too heavy, just get a smaller one, get a smaller camera system. I have, from time to time, it's my own experience, left the long lens back home or back in the car, and then I needed it. And sometimes I have brought it, even though I had a wide angle shot in mind, like in this example here from last summer. I knew I wanted this shot here. That is a very wide angle shot. However, suddenly the conditions changed. I went up on top of the hill and I could use my long lens, and especially my big heavy long lens was necessary to capture these absolutely incredible photos. Another location in the Faroe Islands where I often go, it's a really long hike, it's a really hard hike. However, you just have so many opportunities for photography, from very, very wide angle 12 millimeter and then all the way into 200 millimeter and even more, depending on how you photograph at that location. But it's a single hike and you can basically use all focal lengths on that hike. So generally, the last mistake to avoid is to leave your long lens back home in your camera backpack, because it is just an absolutely incredible tool for landscape photography. So it is almost sunset. Hopefully I will get the shot. It is just, yeah, make or break moment. I have a little bit of glow here behind the trees. I really wanted to just say boom, but you never know. You never know until the show is over. I have a time lapse set up. Hopefully it will catch it all. If not, yeah, it is what it is. I have to come back at another time. If you want to learn how I edit my photos, whether it is high contrast, black and white, monochrome photos, if it's straight into the sun photos with running water in front, if it's something glowy like sunsets or sunrises or atmospheric forest photos, then be sure to enroll in my huge post-processing course, Photoshop for Landscape Photographers. And I really want to make it simple for Lightroom users, those of you who are used to Lightroom, to jump over and start editing in Photoshop. After all, Photoshop is still the king of kings when it comes to photo editing. There is a discount code down in the description, 15% off if you want to save a little bit of money. If you enjoyed this video, I would highly appreciate both a like and a comment. Anything goes. Tell me what you had for breakfast. It does help the YouTube algorithm to see that this is a video worth showing to others. So here is the final photo of today.